The line between old age and treachery and just not giving a fuck is pretty blurred, but when it comes to Edward Preble, it does not exist. Real quick, Edward Preble was born on August 15, 1761 in Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is now Portland, Maine. And even as a child, he had a temper. There's a story of Edward's father, Jedediah Preble, was going on a hunting trip with some friends, and Edward wanted to tag along. Of course, Jedediah Preble didn't want to have a kid involved in his hunting trip, and so he thought he was going to be clever. He told Edward Preble that he had to do his chores in order to be allowed to go on the hunting trip. And so Edward Preble went and did his chores while Jedediah Preble and his friends were getting ready for the hunting trip, trying to sneak away while Edward Preble was busy. When Edward Preble finished his chores and came to shore, he saw that his father and the men on the boat were sailing away to the nearby island where they were going to do the hunting trip, and Edward Preble was pissed. He started throwing rocks at the men and hitting the men in the boat to the point that Jedediah Preble told his friends to turn the boat around to go pick the kid up. Sometimes childish tantrums work. Fast forward to the American Revolutionary War period. Edward Preble, he served in the Continental Navy, and then when the war ended, he became a merchant captain until the United States Navy got established. We are now entering the First Barbary War. In case you didn't know, there are two Barbary Wars, but the second one doesn't happen until after the War of 1812. The Barbary states of Tunis, Algiers, and Tripoli were kidnapping American merchant ships and selling the crew into slavery. And so Thomas Jefferson decided to send squadron after squadron to defeat these pirates, but they weren't successful. And so Edward Preble was the third Commodore to be sent out to the Mediterranean to defeat these pirates. Commodore Edward Preble's flagship was the USS Constitution, and the young officers on board did not like their commander at all. He was moody, he had a violent temper. When talking to him, you had to be at a specific rank because Commodore Edward Preble would not associate with the ordinary seamen. As quick as he was to deal out punishments, at least they were pretty fair. Here's a story about Edward Preble that won the hearts of his men though. 10th September, still plagued by headwinds and calms, the Constitution was only approaching Cadiz. During the early evening, the atmosphere was hazy, but an unidentified sail could be seen in the southeast more or less ahead of the Constitution, on the course of the American frigate was steering. About 8:30 p.m., when darkness was complete and the breeze had dropped away, the watch suddenly discovered that the Constitution was close aboard the ship they had sighted at sunset. Near at hand, she looked to be a ship of war. Memory of the meeting with the Memona was fresh, and the crew was called to quarters. Then Preble hailed the stranger. "What ship is that?" "What ship is that?" the stranger called back. "This is United States frigate Constitution." "What ship is that?" "What ship is that?" replied the uncooperative stranger. "This is the United States frigate Constitution." "What ship is that?" "What ship is that?" Preble's patience, never proverbial, was by now exhausted, and he called out, "I am now going to hail you one last time. If a proper answer is not returned, I will fire a shot into you. If you fire a shot, I'll return a broadside." "What ship is that?" Preble hailed with rising exasperation. "This is His Britannic Majesty's ship, Donegal, 84 guns, Sir Richard Stratton, an English Commodore. Send you aboard on board." That was too much for Preble, who scrambled up into the nettings and shouted, "This is the United States ship Constitution, 44 guns, Edward Preble, an American Commodore, who will be damned before he sends his boat on board any vessel." Then he called to the men gathered around the quarterdeck guns, "Blow your matches, boys!" A few minutes of silence followed this last exchange. Then a boat was heard approaching. A British lieutenant came over the side and explained that his ship was really the frigate Maidstone, Commander George Elliot. Captain Elliot had sighted the Constitution at 4:30 that afternoon, and the Maidstone had realized how close she was to the Constitution only moments before she was hailed by the American frigate. When Preble began hailing, Elliot had not had time to get all of his crew to quarters, and in order to gain time, he was evasive. Not until after his lieutenant had boarded her was Captain Elliot fully convinced that the Constitution was an American frigate. This small incident made a strong impression on Preble's officers. The Commodore's terrible temper had made him disliked by many of them, but by standing up to the British, he made himself a hero of the war room in steerage. This man just did not give a fuck. Here's another story about this psychotic man. Finally, on October 5th, Preble brought the Constitution in the brig Nautilus to anchor in Tangier Bay. Preble did not stalk blindly into a trap as did Commodore Morris at Tunis. He gave positive orders. If the Commodore should be detained forcibly, the frigate and the lesser craft were to bombard the town. Before he left the ship, he called a final conference of his officers so there might be no mistake. Comrades, the result of the approaching interview is known only to God. Be it what it may, during my absence, keep the ships cleared for action. Let every officer and seaman be at his quarters, and if the least injury is offered to my person, immediately attack the batteries, the castle, the city, and the troops, regardless of my personal safety. 2 young midshipmen completed the party going as Preble's aides, where they were escorted to the castle. There they passed through a double file of soldiers in the presence of the emperor. Preble, by his dauntlessness and the sheer force of his personality, retained control of the situation from the start. As he entered the presence, the attendants asked him to turn over his sidearms. His staunchy refusal left no doubt about his intention to retain them, and the matter was not referred to again. Then the emperor had the presumption to ask him to kneel. This too he emphatically refused. Are you not in fear of being detained? The emperor asked. No, sir, Preble answered firmly. If you presume to do so, my squadron, in your full view, will lay your batteries, your castles, and your city in ruins. The emperor grew apologetic. He regretted the breach between the 2 countries. His earnest hope was for peace. He had given no orders provoking the hostilities to American shipping and agreed that any vessel taken should be restored. And that was only the beginning of Preble's tenure as Commodore in the Mediterranean Squadron.